Welcome to the Secular Hub, a community where atheists, agnostics, humanists, and their families can meet, support each other, have fun, and explore ethics, science, and the human condition.
So we're very happy to introduce Dr. Eugenie Scott, who is the former executive director of the National Center for Science Education, and that's abbreviated NCSE, and you'll probably hear a lot about that organization today. So Dr. Scott and I will be referring to it as NCSE, probably. It's a nonprofit organization, membership organization of scientists, teachers, and others that works to improve the teaching of science as a way of knowing, the teaching of evolution, and in addition, a fairly recent addition to their agenda, the teaching of climate change in science classes. Dr. Scott is a former college professor and is an internationally known expert on the creationism and evolution controversy and science denialism, which is something we're all pretty concerned about here, especially in the last 4 years, and is called upon by the press and other media to explain science to the general public. And she has been interviewed on cable news channels like MSNBC and Fox even, and so on. She authored the book, Evolution versus Creationism, an introduction. And with her colleague, Glenn Branch, who is currently with NCSE, they co-edited the book, Not in Our Classrooms, Why Intelligent Design is Wrong for Our Schools. She is the recipient of numerous awards from scientists and educators and has been awarded 10 honorary degrees. She has served on the board of trustees of the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I believe she's still on that organization. I think she's the treasurer. And Jeannie, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And she is a member of the board of advisors for the publication Scientific American. She's also a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. Dr. Scott was also elected to the California Academy of Sciences and formerly served as president of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. She's also won the Richard Dawkins Award, which is an annual prize recognizing those who exemplify values of secularism and rationalism. And hopefully most of you know who Richard Dawkins is. She includes some university teaching in her career and in anthropology, and included a short time at CU Boulder. And this is pretty cool. I didn't know this. Asteroid 249540 Eugenie Scott was named for her. So she has an asteroid named for her. And that happened in 2014. So I'm going to end with that and hand it over to Dr. Eugenie Scott, who will take us through this journey 15 years ago about the law case, the court case Kitzmiller versus Dover, and why we have to remember it. So, yes.
Thank you. I'm assuming you're all seeing my slides and everything is perfect, because that's what we expect from Zoom, correct? As Becky said, I have spent some time in Colorado, and quite honestly, if I didn't live where I live today, I would move to Colorado in a heartbeat. It's my second favorite place to live. Okay, why should you care about a legal decision 15 years ago? Well, I believe that Kitzmiller versus Dover, if it had not ended up the way it did, science education would be very, very different today, and not in a good way. But first, some good news. Let's try to get this to work. There we go. Last year, in the journal Evolution, Education, and Outreach, published an article on a national survey of public high school biology teachers that was conducted in 2019 by researchers at Penn State and my colleagues at the National Center for Science Education. Now, Eric Putzer from Penn State had in 2007 published a very extensive previous survey of high school biology teachers, and it was quite disturbing in many, many respects. One of the things that he found was that only 51% of practicing high school biology teachers presented evolution the way it would be presented in a university, the way I presented it as a university professor, and as it's presented down the road at University of Denver or CU or any place else, as the consensus view of science and a done deal, basically factual. That's pretty puny. The good news is that in 2019, these researchers conducted this survey again, asked some of the same questions on current practicing biology teachers, and found that 67% of teachers emphasize the scientific consensus. And there's other good news in the study as well. If you wanted to check it out, the reference would be at the NCSE website. So why do I bring up the study? Well, as much as I'd like to claim that Kitzmiller versus Dover is responsible for the improvement in evolution education in the last 15 years, that might be stretching things a bit. And I don't want you to think that I am dealing in alternate facts, shall we say. But the authors of this more recent 2019 study highlight the fact of the adoption of state science education standards over the last 10, 12 plus years. Most of which, if not, well, I'd even say almost all of which, include the directive that teachers should be teaching evolution, and they should be teaching it as established science, not as something that is questionable. And I believe that Kitzmiller was part of the environment that brought about this really quite salutary development in the inclusion of evolution in science education standards, which are adopted by individual states. Now, I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later on, but first, a little history, because obviously everything that happens today is related to history. The past has a great deal of influence on the present. And certainly the history of anti-evolutionism in the United States has had a very colorful history. Now, some of you are quite familiar with this history. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I think it's important to set the stage, as it were, for why Kitzmiller was the kind of case that it was. Now, evolution began to enter the high school classroom around the turn of the 20th century. And interesting fact, we don't have any problems with creationism or anti-evolutionism if nobody's teaching evolution. It's only when evolution comes into the curriculum that the creationists get upset about it and start pushing back, and that's when we have these controversies. And this is what happened at the turn of the century. The heyday of the period of banning evolution took place between about 1919 and about 1927. And this, of course, includes 1925, the Scopes trial, featuring William Jennings Bryan on the right, Clarence Darrow on the left, the most famous legal figures of their day. And of course, the Scopes trial is legendary as this wonderful face-off between modernism and traditionalism, and the way the press treated the folks of Dayton, Tennessee as a bunch of country bumpkins. Clearly, modernism won, but people either don't know or they kind of forget that Scopes lost. And the law that he was tried for breaking, which was the Butler Act, a law banning the teaching of evolution. He supposedly taught evolution, and the trial took place and all that. I trust you're somewhat familiar with the very famous Scopes trial. It stayed on the books until the 1970s, really. And evolution very quietly slipped out of the high school curriculum. It disappeared from textbooks first, and then ultimately just was not taught anymore. And it didn't come back for about 30 years. the science education reforms of the Sputnik era in the late 50s and early 60s set the stage for the return of evolution to the curriculum. Now, you've probably been reading about Sputnik V, as in Sputnik vaccine. This is the Russian COVID vaccine that takes its name from the original Sputnik, which is what you see on the screen. Sputnik was, of course, a satellite that the Russians put up, and it orbited the United States before the United States had such a satellite. And so this just really concentrated the attention of the American political and scientific establishment. And the federal government started pouring money into the newly formed National Science Foundation, NIH, and science education as well. So what happened was the government put together these committees in all of the four basic sciences of physics, chemistry, biology, and earth sciences, and put together teams of scientists and master teachers to just completely rewrite textbooks, because textbooks were written by publishers and they weren't very good. And of course, because these were written by university and industry scientists, they of course included evolution. And these books sold well, so the commercial publishers got on board. They started including evolution in their textbooks. And of course, that meant there was pushback by the creationists once evolution came back into the curriculum. But Arkansas saw the state of Arkansas, the state of Tennessee, and I think Florida all had passed these Scopes era anti-evolution laws. And the NEA, the National Education Association of affiliate in Arkansas, that, we ought to get rid of this silly book silly law that's on the books that nobody really pays any attention to, because here are these new textbooks coming in. They include evolution. We've got a law against the teaching of evolution in our state. So why don't we just get rid of these silly laws? Let's just challenge this law in court. And they chose a 25-year-old high school biology teacher named Susan Epperson to be the plaintiff. And she just thought this was going to be a little housekeeping kind of thing. And so did the NEA. And imagine her surprise when the state judge upheld the anti-evolution law. And eventually the case Epperson versus Arkansas went all the way to the Supreme Court. Susan Epperson is one of your great treasures in the state of Colorado, by the way. She lives in Colorado Springs, and until her retirement a few years ago, she taught chemistry in the local community college. Wonderful woman and a good friend. Well, what happened was Epperson versus Arkansas went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck down the anti-evolution laws that Arkansas had, and which had been pioneered, of course, in Tennessee by Scopes. So it was no longer legal to ban the teaching of evolution. Well, the return of evolution to the high school and the lack of the ability to ban it brought in the next era of the anti-evolution crusade, the period of balancing evolution. Now, initially, this took the form of requiring students to teach Genesis if they taught evolution. In other words, just bring the Bible into the classroom. You might recall the First Amendment, which has two clauses about religion: the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And the Establishment Clause, of course, is that the state, no governmental institution, can advance religion. The Free Exercise Clause says that no governmental institution can inhibit religion. So the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses, when you take them together, and they are together, they are equal sides of the same coin, means that state institutions have to be religiously neutral, which means schools have to be religiously neutral. They cannot promote a religious view like creationism. They can't bring the Bible into the school and teach its content as if these were factual statements. That would be in violation of the Establishment Clause. And the Establishment Clause has been part of every single creation and evolution lawsuit. Since Epperson and even a little bit before. Now, You can't ban evolution. You can't balance evolution with the teaching of the Bible. What are you going to do if you don't want your kids to learn evolution? In the early 1960s, a movement developed called creation science. And creation science, or sometimes scientific creationism, it's a movement that claims that it's possible to support a literal Genesis view with science, that there supposedly is data and theory that would support a special creation of all things at one time in their present form, which is really the essence of the special creation point of view. The most common view promotes the idea that the Earth is only thousands of years old, but there are other views as well. Now, I probably don't have to tell this audience that there isn't any scientific evidence for this. Basically, the major activity of creation science is sifting through the scientific literature, trying to find little anomalies that they could pull out and wave about and say, aha, this is incompatible with evolution taking place. Therefore, creationism did, which is sort of a peculiar way of dealing with scientific evidence, but this is what you will find in creation science. What a judge referred to as a contrived dualism, the idea that there's only two alternatives. There's either evolution or creationism, and only one of them can be true, which actually is the case, at least in the version that the creation science people provide, is a way of thinking that encourages them to believe that all you have to do is disprove evolution and creationism wins by default. If you disprove evolution, if you have evidence against evolution, you don't have to have evidence for creationism, which again is a peculiar way of doing science, but there you go. I'm going to come back to this idea of evidence against evolution when I talk about intelligent design and when I talk about Kitzmiller and after Kitzmiller. But this is a basic tenet of the creationist way of thinking. Well, during the 1970s and early 1980s, there was legislation introduced in over 20 plus states in the United States that would require that if you taught evolution, students would also have to be taught creation science. And the state of Arkansas and the state of Louisiana passed equal time bills. And the Louisiana course, they were both challenged in court, but the Louisiana case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled in 1987 in Edwards versus Aguilar that the teaching of creation science was unconstitutional because even though they called it science, it was clearly a religious view and it violated the Establishment Clause. In striking down the teaching of really sectarian religion in public schools, the court also commented that teachers could certainly teach, as Brennan wrote, all scientific theories about the origin of humankind, just not religious ones. Now, of course, creationists already considered creation science to be a scientific theory, but since it failed, they had to come up with another one. And they did, and they called it intelligent design. So even if they couldn't teach creation science, they reasoned that they could accomplish their goals by teaching intelligent design. I'm going to come back to Scalia's dissent a little bit later on, but let me just quickly call your attention to this dissent, where Scalia wrote that teachers could teach the evidence against evolution, and this became another anti-evolution strategy. As I mentioned before, when I talked about that contrived dualism, creationists think dichotomously. There's either evolution or creationism. The evidence against evolution proves creationism, so they win. So the evidence against evolution creationism was one that creationists seized upon after the Edwards decision. But first, let me talk about intelligent design. Now, it's fun to talk about intelligent design. We don't really have time. The main subject of this evening's talk is Kitzmiller. But just very quickly, intelligent design is really a subset of creation science. It focuses on the idea of design, that there are some natural phenomena that categorically cannot be explained through natural causes, such as the origin of life, they claim. They claim that this category of natural phenomena can only be explained by reference to an intelligence. Of course, the intelligence is God, but intelligent design proponents believe that by being a bit less obvious about their religious roots, they would be able to duck the Establishment Clause. But everything found in intelligent design is also found in creation science, which is why the Venn diagram is drawn the way it is. It's also the case that creation science makes claims that you don't find in ID. For example, you don't find the intelligent design proponents talking about the age of the earth, and a young age of the earth is one of the major tenets of creation science. And you don't find the ID proponents talking about flood geology, that all the sedimentary deposits on the planet are the result of the receding waters of Noah's Ark. And intelligent design succeeded remarkably well in being taken as a serious criticism of evolution from when it appeared in the early 1990s through the mid-2000s. After the mid-2000s, it faded, and this brings us to Kitzmiller. Dover, Pennsylvania is a small community in south central Pennsylvania and the site of a lawsuit in federal district court, Kitzmiller versus Dover, in 2005. If we were all in the same place, I'd say, how many of you remember this case? And a whole bunch of hands would go up from old folks. But there are a lot of people who've never heard of Kitzmiller. It was at the time a very large news story, and all the networks and major print publications covered it. Nova produced a 2-hour documentary in 2007 that called Judgment Day, which is excellent. Judgment Day got a Peabody Award and also an award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science in the category of scientific journalism. I want to play you a clip of Judgment Day just to kind of set the stage a little bit.
In October 2004, a war broke out in the small town of Dover, Pennsylvania.
Today, the teachers in a rural Pennsylvania town became the first in the country required to tell students that evolution is not the only theory.
It started when the Dover Area School Board passed a policy requiring that its high school science classes include a controversial subject called intelligent design. Proponents of intelligent design claim that many features of living organisms are too complex to have evolved entirely through the natural process of evolution, as Charles Darwin proposed. Instead, they claim some aspects of those organisms must have been created, fully formed by a so-called intelligent designer. And advocates contend intelligent design is a bold new scientific theory with the power to overthrow the theory of evolution.
It's scientists debating science based on the evidence, not based on any religious text or authority, and it's clearly, properly the subject of a science class.
It's in fact opening the path of inquiry to new ways of thinking about things.
Evolution by natural selection is a scientific doctrine, then a critique of that doctrine is a legitimate part of science as well.
The Dover School Board demanded that science teachers read their students a 1-minute statement claiming that gaps in the theory of evolution exist, and putting forward intelligent design as an alternative. The statement also directed students to an intelligent design textbook called Of Pandas and People that would be made available. But many Dover residents and an overwhelming number of scientists throughout the country were outraged. They say intelligent design is nothing but religion in disguise, the latest front in the war on evolution.
The goal of intelligent design is to try to re-Christianize American society.
Intelligent design is not anywhere a scientific concept. It's not a field of science. It's not being actively researched by anyone.
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
The stage was set for a battle that would pit friend against friend and neighbor against neighbor.
It was like we shot somebody's dog. I mean, there was a blow up like you couldn't believe.
This is like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
Before it was over, this battle would land the school board in federal court. No cameras were allowed in the courtroom, so to bring this historic showdown between evolution and intelligent design to light, Nova has dramatized key scenes from court transcripts. It was a 6-week trial in which modern biology was Exhibit A. And hanging in the balance was not just the Dover biology curriculum. The future of science education in America, the separation of church and state, and the very nature of scientific inquiry were all on trial.
There had been previous skirmishes over evolution in Dover, but the conflict heated up, as the movie said, in 2004, when it was time to adopt a new biology textbook, and the teachers wanted to have the more recent edition of the book that they had been using, which was Prentice Hall's Biology. And unfortunately, school board member Bill Buckingham, he's the one in the clip who said it was like we shot somebody's dog. Colorful fellow. Buckingham accused Miller and Levine's book of being laced with Darwinism. And he proposed that if you're going to use Prentice Hall biology, you have to supplement it with this intelligent design book called Of Pandas and People. During the summer of 2004, the board told the science department that they were to read the intelligent design book Of Pandas and People and watch an ID video called Icons of Evolution. And the teachers did so, and they were unimpressed. They told the board that they didn't think either the book or the video was high enough science quality. They thought, they mentioned that the science was really wrong. And besides, pedagogically, these were not books that were written for high school. They just, there are ways that you approach science in high school that fit the curriculum, that fit the state standards, et cetera, and these guys didn't make the grade. But in the fall of 2004, the board told the teachers that unless they accepted the Pandas book, they wouldn't get their textbook. Basically, they held Miller and Levine, they held the Prentice Hall book hostage, requiring the teachers to present intelligent design. Now, this is vanishingly rare. It's extremely unusual that a school board would be this heavy-handed. Generally speaking, they leave things like textbook selection up to teachers. This is a very unusual thing. Well, teachers continued to resist, although they, being teachers, this is a helping profession, they attempted to compromise as much as they could, and there were skirmishes about putting copies of Pandas in the school library rather than in the classroom, and things went round and round and round. But the board was absolutely relentless. In October 2004, they passed a policy that read, students will be made aware of gaps/problems in Darwin's theory and of other theories of evolution, including but not limited to intelligent design. When one of my staff members came in and said, hey, guess what they've just done out here in Pennsylvania? Here's this new policy. I read it, and the first thing that I thought was this was not written by the English department. If you diagram the sentence, and we ex-English majors sometimes do that. If you diagram the sentence, students will be made aware of gaps and problems in Darwin's theory and intelligent design, but I digress. At any rate, the next month, the teachers notified the board that they were unwilling to treat intelligent design as comparable to evolution, to treat it as a science, and that they really needed the board to be more specific about what it is they were being expected to teach. The board countered by telling, and I don't read this, okay? Please don't bother reading this. This is a prompt. The board countered by telling the teachers that they had to read a statement to students before beginning any lesson on evolution. Now, this statement was 4 paragraphs long, and it suggested that intelligent design was an alternative to evolution. Well, the teachers weren't about to take this lying down. They did something incredibly brave at that point. they refused the school board's directive. They just flat said, intelligent design is not science. We will not teach this. And the only person who was tenured in this entire science department was the lady bottom row left, Bertha Spar. Everybody else was untenured. They could have been sacked by the school board for, at will, basically. Most of them were young, as you see, untenured. The teachers tried very, very hard to get the board to compromise, to not make them violate their professional standards, but the school board refused to budge. They were completely recalcitrant. There also were lots of school board meetings during the year where citizens would come up and say, up with this we would not put. And the board just refused to do anything other than just sort of bowl their way through. So the only thing left to do was bring a lawsuit. I always try to explain to people that NCSE does not go looking for lawsuits. They are expensive. They suck away all of your time and all of your staff effort, and they are absolutely exhausting. We always try to work behind the scenes to solve problems so people don't have to go to court. But this was a lawsuit. This was a board that was simply unable or unwilling, I should say. Their ability obviously existed, but this was a board that was unwilling to compromise in any respect. So a group of citizens in the community contacted us. We helped put together a legal team. The legal team consisted of the NCSE as advisors, the ACLU, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and a large national law firm with a big office in Philadelphia, Pepper Hamilton. One of the lawyers at Pepper Hamilton was a member of NCSE's Legal Advisory Committee, who is the one who brought them on as pro bono lawyers. We didn't file, the lawyers filed the lawsuit on December 18, 2004, and the trial began in September of 2005. So that is 9 months, roughly, a long gestation. The trial took place over 6 weeks. On the other side was the Thomas More Law Center from Michigan, and their motto is the sword and shield for people of faith, led by Richard Thompson in the lower left there. Now, people have often asked me, why couldn't we just go to the judge and say, Judge, the policy of the Dover School Board is a terrible policy. It's educationally bankrupt. It is scientifically ridiculous. It'll do nothing but miseducate the children. Don't let them do it. Which would be a great thing if we could, but the judge would just say, go home, because there's absolutely nothing in the Constitution that says that you are prohibited from teaching bad science. What there is in the Constitution is the Establishment Clause, and that is what we had to deal with. The Establishment Clause, you recall, talks about the inadvisability, the illegality of public institutions advancing religion. So we had to focus on the religious aspects of intelligent design, although, as you'll see, there was a great deal of focus on science as well. Now, on the other side, because the bottom line was constitutional issues, what the defense's lawyers had to demonstrate was that teaching intelligent design was being done for a secular reason. There's a pedagogical value to teaching intelligent design. Wasn't being taught to promote religion, no siree, Bob. Just nobody here but us secularists, I guess is a way of looking at it. The other side also had to demonstrate that intelligent design is valid science. If it had religious implications, that might be okay as long as it was a real science. If it was a real science, that would take care of the secular, the pedagogical reason for teaching it. So they had to come up with the scientific bona fides of intelligent design. Further, they needed to show that evolution was actually shaky science, which would make a stronger case for teaching intelligent design. And they had a whole bunch of people originally listed as expert witnesses, but as it happened, most of these people ended up dropping out, which is a wonderful story, but I don't have time to go into it tonight. Anticipating their approach, on our side, we needed to show that intelligent design, au contraire, was religion. It was a form of creation science. Now, you remember that the Supreme Court in the Edwards versus Aguilar decision had struck down creation science as being religious advocacy. So if we could tie intelligent design to creation science, we'd win. Full stop. That was, that was really the ultimate goal that we had to have. We also had to show that there was no valid secular reason for teaching intelligent design. Pardon me just a moment, please. See if I can get rid of that frog in my throat. We need to show that intelligent design was not science. It required supernatural intervention, which is outside of science. And quite frankly, the only intelligence that they're talking about is God. And we had to show them that intelligent design was factually wrong. The fact, what few fact claims intelligent design actually made were not supported by any kind of evidence. They were alternative facts, if you will. And what possible valid pedagogical reason would there be for teaching kids incorrect information? And because we knew that the other side was going to hammer away at it, we had to support the idea that evolution was solid science. We had to defend evolution. Remember that one aspect of the Dover policy was this gaps/problems in evolution section, which we had to dispel, that there's really no problems with evolution. Now, we began with a scientist, with the cell biologist Ken Miller. We ended with a scientist, the paleontologist Kevin Padian. We did this starting and ending with a scientist because we wanted to signal to the judge that science was important in this trial. That, yes, obviously the legal decision, the constitutional decision would have to be made on the basis of the Establishment Clause, but we also, for these reasons listed in that section there, we also really needed the judge to take the science seriously, and that is what we did. There was a lot of science in this trial. As Margaret Talbot said in the New Yorker, for 6 weeks, the courtroom of Judge John E. Jones III was like the biology class you wished you could have taken. At the end of the first day of testimony with Ken Miller, the cell biologist, who was if you've ever met Ken Miller, he's very enthusiastic. He's a wonderful science communicator. He's really a treasure. He was kind of bouncing in his seat talking about all the wonderful aspects of cell biology that everybody should know about. And at the end of the first day of testimony, the judge, who had a bit of a dry sense of humor, looked out at the audience and said, "Class dismissed." It was said jokingly, but there was a whole lot of science in this trial. I'm going to play you a little clip from Matthew Chapman, who is Darwin's great-great-grandson. I might have left out a great. Anyway, here's
watch the whole thing. You got an education in what evolution was, where evolution stands as a theory now in the 21st century. If you concentrated, you would get sucked into this thing, and the day would go by, and you'd come out and you'd think, that was amazing what I heard here. And these eloquent people, with these incredible educations, and it was fantastic.
In preparation for the Dover trial, NCSC scoured its archives and found in an obscure creationist publication called Students for Origins Research, way back in 1981, an article, a little tiny article, talking about the Foundation for Thought and Ethics, which is a Texas conservative Christian organization, reporting that they were working on a textbook for biology. The book was described as being, as it says here, present both evolution and creation while limiting discussion to scientific data. Now, this, of course, is vintage creation science. The creation science proponents claim they can demonstrate the truth of special creation through science. Now, the Foundation for Thought and Ethics textbook didn't appear for several years. This article came up in 1981, but we didn't hear anything about it. And we figured that this is the book that eventually became Of Pandas and People, the book that was really at the heart of the Kitzmiller trial. Now, one of my staff members was saying, gee, you know, if there are early manuscripts of this Foundation for Thought and Ethics books, their planned biology textbook, we could probably tie that into Pandas and People, and this would show the creationist origins of intelligent design. And Nick Motzke, one of my staff members, sent an email to the legal team saying, hey, you know, we think maybe it might be interesting to see if we could get hold of some of these early manuscripts. By that afternoon, the legal team had subpoenaed any early manuscripts of the book from the Foundation for Thought and Ethics. It was very fast. Now, there must have been considerable disappointment in the halls of the Foundation for Thought and Ethics, because these early manuscripts made the point very clearly that intelligent design was just repackaged creation science. Now, along the x-axis here, you see the manuscripts arranged by date. There's Creation Biology, 1983, Biology and Creation, 1986, Biology and Origins, 1987. Then they started using the name Of Pandas and People, and there were two versions of Pandas and People in 1987, which we cleverly have called here version 1 and version 2. Then there's a 1989, finally Pandas and People got published. The first edition was in 1989, and then a second edition of Pandas and People came out in 1993. One of my colleagues, Wes Ellsbury, wrote a computer script to count words and phrases in these manuscripts, and we were able to match up these manuscripts and demonstrate, you know, very clearly that this was a continuous series of manuscripts. These were not seven separate books, but this was all of a piece. All of these manuscripts were related to one another. The inclusion of the word creationism is shown in the red line. The number of times the word creationist or cognates of creationism occurs. The blue is the number of times the phrase intelligent design occurs. Now, you might note that the lines cross between the two 1987 drafts of Pandas and People. And sharp-eared listeners will recall that 1987 is when the Supreme Court Edwards versus Aguillard struck down the teaching of creation science. It certainly appears as if the authors just changed the phrasing and kept the same ideas. And we thought, well, that in itself is pretty good, but we really needed to drive the point home even more clearly. So we made comparisons of sections of the various drafts of these manuscripts, including a very interesting paragraph, which I am delighted to share with you. Now, here's the paragraph. 1986, Biology and Creation. Creation means that the various forms of life began abruptly through the agency of an intelligent creator, with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks, and wings. This wording remains the same through Biology and Origins, 1987. It's also present in the first draft of the book titled Of Pandas and People. The creation language is used in all of these earlier manuscripts. And remember again, 1987 is the year that the Supreme Court struck down the teaching of creation science as unconstitutional advocacy of religion. Creation means that various forms of life began abruptly through the agency of an intelligent creator with their distinctive features already intact, etc. Suddenly, in the second draft of Pandas, later in 1987, the text changes to intelligent design means the various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency. You can't say creator because you're gonna get hit over the head with the First Amendment. An intelligent agency, let's be vague, with their distinctive features already intact: fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks, and wings. We were kind of dancing around the office for about a week after we found this, thinking, birds with feathers, beaks, and wings. We were so happy. It's probably not coincidental that this change followed the Supreme Court decision. Here's another little story that's kind of fun that I would like to share with you. In the 1983 creation biology draft, this phrase occurs: evolutionists think the former is correct, creationists conclude the latter is correct. And the 1986 biology and creation draft has pretty much the same phrase: evolutionists think the former is correct, creationists accept the latter view. Now, this wording is also maintained in the first 1987 draft of the book, entitled Of Pandas and People. Evolutionists think the former is correct, creationists accept the latter view. This changes, however, in the second post-Supreme Court decision of Pandas and People. Evolutionists think the former is correct, co-design proponentsists accept the latter view. It would be fun if I could see you, because I'm sure you're giggling, because this is definitely giggle-worthy. This is not only a lesson in how not to do block and paste, but it is also a wonderful missing link between creationism and intelligent design. But you know something? As delicious as this is, and if you Google co-design proponentsists, you will find many gleeful representations of this in evolutionist websites and blogs and the like. We actually did not use this in the Kitzmiller trial. The NCSE team really wanted to, but the lawyers, they probably were tempted, but the lawyers decided that they already had just beaten to death this idea that intelligent design really is the direct descendant of creation science, that they figured that this would be overkill, and they didn't really want to have the judge think that we were wasting his time, quite honestly. So co-design proponentsists is definitely part of the Kitzmiller versus Dover lore, but it's an urban legend in that we did not actually use it in the trial itself, but it is part of the materials. I mentioned that one of our goals was to show that intelligent design wasn't science because it resorted to supernatural explanations. And all of our scholars and scientists, including John Haught, the theologian, discussed the nature of science. They all made the point that methodological naturalism is the heart of understanding science as it is practiced today. That science is restricted to explanation through natural causes. Every single one of our expert witnesses made this point. The scientist, the philosopher of science, the theologian, the historian, and the expert on science education. Now, intelligent design, of course, claims there's no explanation for complex or improbable natural phenomena, and intelligence, which can only be God, has to be the explanation. And this, once you start positing supernatural explanations, go for it, knock yourself out, but you can't call it science. And that was a point that we brought home over and over and over. Our witnesses also stressed that real science requires the testing of explanations, and intelligent design proponents were not doing this. They were merely asserting their position without actually doing the scientific work to support it. They all discussed peer review, that intelligent design proponents are not subjecting their position to scholarly peer review. On the contrary, they were taking it right to the high school classroom as if it were already established science. And they are not publishing their research because there isn't any. And as a result, intelligent design had not entered the scientific or any other scholarly consensus. It wasn't considered good philosophy of science. It was not considered good theology either. And they basically did not make the grade across the board. Kitzmiller wasn't a case won only upon science. Remember that we needed to show that intelligent design was religious, and ideally that the school board had religious intent for passing the policy. And we definitely got help from actions of school board members themselves, who, among other things, had made religious arguments during several school board meetings discussing textbooks and the intelligent design policy. These were very contentious school board meetings. A lot of citizens showed up to address the board and argue with the positions. Oddly enough, recordings of those school board meetings mysteriously disappeared. So one of the problems that we had in the trial was it became sort of a he said, she said situation where school board members denied saying things like, 2,000 years ago, someone died on a cross. Can't someone take a stand for him? Which is not the sort of thing that you would expect a school board member to say in a public school board meeting as an argument for a policy measure. But there were reporters who had reported on the school board meetings, and there were witnesses. But if those school board meeting recordings hadn't mysteriously disappeared, it would have been a lot easier for us. Defense witnesses William Buckingham and Alan Bonsall also did not endear themselves to the judge when it became clear that, if you want to put it kindly, they had been evasive, or at worst, they lied under oath during their depositions. And when they had been deposed, they claimed that they had no idea where money to purchase 60 copies of Pandas and People to put in the library had come from. And actually, Mr. Buckingham had solicited money from members of his church for the purpose of buying and donating the book to the high school. We had a check written by Mr. Buckingham to Mr. Bonsall's father, who purchased the books. Under cross-examination in the trial, Bonsall and Buckingham tried to dodge and weave and ended up just infuriating the judge. And there's a very, very dramatic part of the trial where the judge just basically said, wait a second, and waved the lawyer to be quiet. And the judge turned and started questioning the witnesses, which is something that doesn't happen very often. And when it does happen, it's not a good thing for the witness. You can read the sharpness of his questions, and transcripts of the entire trial are on NCSE's website. Well, I'm probably not spoiling the end by telling you that Science won and Intelligent Design lost. And that little gray-haired lady over there in the corner is grinning for an extremely good reason, because it was an absolutely huge victory. The judge granted the plaintiffs $2 million in court costs, which I suspect made a lot of school districts around the country swallow hard when thinking about passing policies like Dover had. But remember that Kitzmiller wasn't appealed. It was it began and ended in the Middle District of Pennsylvania, which is a big part of Pennsylvania, but it's only one federal district court area. And what happened was the judge issued his decision on December 20th of 2005. We refer to that as Kitzmas. But there had been a school board election the previous November, the month before. And basically they voted the rascals out. There was a new school board that opposed the policy. They just wanted to be done with it. They didn't want to have anything to do with this intelligent design policy. So they were not inclined to appeal this decision, as much as it would have been wonderful for the evolution and creation controversy in the future, because this was such a strong decision, and our witnesses were so good, and our lawyers were so good, and theirs were so awful that our case was so very, very, very strong. And the judge wrote this very long decision where he spelled out and even said in his decision, I'm going into this detail so that nobody else has to go through this, because this was ridiculous what they tried to do. So it wasn't appealed. There was no appeal court decision. If it had gone to the appeals or the Supreme Court, we would have won in a walk, because it was a very, very wonderful decision from our point of view. But even if the decision is precedent only in the Middle District of Pennsylvania, and not throughout the Third Circuit, much less throughout the country. It has been hugely influential, mostly in terms of things that didn't occur. So what then is the effect of Kitzmiller versus Dover? Well, the Kitzmiller decision was so strong, so solid, so thorough, that the thought of requiring the teaching of intelligent design was just shelved by intelligent design proponents. This doesn't mean that intelligent design disappeared, but the balanced strategy faded fairly quickly. To see what came next, though, in the anti-evolution movement, let me take you back to the Edwards decision. Remember that in the dissent to Edwards, Scalia said that teachers could teach the evidence against evolution. And remember, this is part of that contrived dualism of creationists. They're thinking that evidence against evolution is evidence for creationism. So really all you have to do is disprove evolution and you're home free. So even if creationism and of course later intelligent design wasn't constitutional to teach, much of the same effect could be achieved if they taught evidence against evolution. So this brings us to the third and current historical stage of anti-evolutionism, the belittling stage. By the way, I owe Glenn Branch thanks for this ban, balance, and belittle nomenclature. It's quite clever, but Glenn is very clever. So the contention here is that go ahead and teach evolution because you have to teach evolution, but also teach that evolution is weak science so that it's discredited. In the belittling period, which is where we are now, religious issues are downplayed. The courts have spoken, so creationists need to present an approach that doesn't look like it's religious. They know they're going to lose if it does. There are a number of catchphrases associated with this third wave. They talk about evolution as theory, not fact. They talk about teachers should teach the controversy, which is this really offensive to a scientist idea that teachers should pretend to students that scientists are arguing about whether evolution took place. We aren't. We're arguing about the details, but that's not the controversy that they want teachers to teach. They have an academic freedom aspect. Well, we should let the teachers teach what they consider to be good science. Actually, high school teachers don't have academic freedom. They sign a contract, they teach the curriculum of the school district in which they are employed, and they do not have the kind of academic freedom that you find at the university level. They suggest teaching the evidence for and evidence against evolution. Well, the only place you can find the evidence against evolution, the so-called evidence against evolution, is in the creationist literature. So bingo, they win there too. They talk about teaching the strengths and weaknesses of evolution. Similarly, the only place you can find the weaknesses of evolution is in the creationist literature. Aha, works out really well. One of the more clever phrases is the critical analysis of evolution. If you know this literature, you know pretty quickly that critical analysis means criticize and so on. There's an interesting shift from balancing to belittling, which is illustrated by my friend and former NCSE employee, Nick Motzke. Now, I have to say, over the years, some very remarkable people have worked at NCSE, and one of whom is this guy. Nick Motzke went on to become Dr. Nicholas Motzke, evolutionary biologist. He's now a professor at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And he published a paper a few years back that very nicely illustrates the change from the balancing approach to the belittling approach. And he published it in Science magazine, which is pretty darn good. Motzke took an NCSE database of the texts of legislation submitted since 2004 and analyzed it as one might analyze a group of fossils or DNA evidence or molecular systems. He broke the text into phrases and traced how the phrases were repeated or not repeated in subsequent pieces of legislation through time. Much as one might take morphological or biochemical characteristics of fossils or living forms, if you're a biogeographer, Nick is a biogeographer, and trace relationships among them through time. What you get is a phylogenetic tree of the anti-evolution measures. He traces the evolution of the set of bills from 2004 to 2015. Now, let me just show you how this works, because it's really fun stuff. Time runs along the bottom. At the left is 2004, on the right is 2016. Now, the bills themselves are indicated at the ends of the branches. So this is a South Dakota bill from 2014. If you drop it down, that's 2014. Here's an Iowa bill from 2009. If you drop it down, it intersects the x-axis at 2009. Now, the ancestor of all of these bills is a group of bills originating in Alabama in 2004. Now, in 2004, a group of bills, collectively called the Academic Freedom Bills, began to appear and spread. They promoted the teaching of creationism in the guise of protecting a teacher's academic freedom to teach all the evidence or the full range of scientific views. Now, this phrase, full range of scientific views, came from a sense of the Senate amendment that was posted to the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act that Senator Santorum got passed. The Santorum Amendment was written by intelligent design proponent, UC Berkeley law professor Philip Johnson, whom you saw in that Judgment Day clip. Now, under the guise of teaching the full range of scientific views, teachers would be encouraged to teach the alternative scientific view called intelligent design. The belief was that since scientific views are legitimately taught, intelligent design should be legitimately taught, as it is part of the full range of scientific views. Now, the other approach running through these bills is that they're permissive. They don't require teachers to do A or B. They allow teachers to bring in the full range of scientific views, which is very clever from a legal standpoint because it makes a challenge on the face of the law much more difficult. Later in the 2000s, the Scalia evidence against evolution position began to be emphasized in legislation, where a new generation of bills called the Science Education Acts were more explicit about teachers teaching the strengths and weaknesses of evolution and similar wording, reflecting supposed evidence against evolution. Here they are together. The blue are the Academic Freedom Acts, the full range of scientific views, in other words, intelligent design, and the green are the Science Education Act, which is the strengths and weaknesses set of bills. Now, of course, there's some overlap. The academic freedom wording didn't go away in 1 year, but the full range of views encouraging the teaching of intelligent design seemed to largely fade away in the mid-2000s, the last gasp of the balancing strategy, replaced by Scalia's evidence against evolution or strengths and weaknesses on this chart. I think the reason for this was that Kitzmiller was just so soundly trashed intelligent design that the full range of scientific views found in the Academic Freedom Acts, the blue part there, was no longer tenable. Creationists had gone from teaching that Creationists had gone from teaching the Bible to teaching creation science to teaching intelligent design, and there wasn't much else they could do to wash religion out of their position. Failing to get some form of creationism into the classroom, they shifted to attacking evolution, in other words, the belittling approach. After about 2006, there are precious few intelligent design bills that crop up in this sequence. Take the black stretches there are the ill-fated intelligent design efforts. The teaching of intelligent design clearly fell out of favor. But what if Kitzmiller had declared that intelligent design was actually a valid scientific alternative to evolution and thus legal to teach? I put together a little graphic showing the states that I think would have been candidates for passing ID-friendly legislation. Red is states where AFA or SEA legislation has been introduced since Kitzmiller, not necessarily passed, most didn't. Pink is states where ID-friendly legislation has been introduced at some time in the recent past, not a lot of states left. If Kitzmiller versus Dover had gone the other way, if intelligent design had been declared legal to teach, I think it's safe to say that these states and districts would have skipped the effort to pass academic freedom or Science Education Act type laws and gone straight to introducing pro-intelligent design legislation. No sense in playing games with strengths and weaknesses when you can teach the real thing. There are many local school districts around the country that have flirted with intelligent design as well, and likely would have passed Dover-like policies, despite what happened at the state level. The trickle down for Kitzmiller would have had serious consequences in other ways as well. Another consequence would have been in the writing and adoption of state science education standards. If ID had been declared legal to teach, there would have been considerable pressure throughout the states to include intelligent design and possibly other creationist ideas in state science education standards. The Next Generation Science Standards, or the NGSS, is an advisory set of standards that states can adopt if they want to. And, just recall how really decentralized the American education system is. Decisions are made at the local level, secondarily at the state level, and hardly any decisions, and certainly hardly anything that I can think of having to do with curriculum, is ever done at the national level. So the NGSS are only advisory. States can take them or leave them. The NCSS is very solid. It was based upon an advisory document prepared by the National Academy of Sciences. The science is solid. Evolution has a solid place in it. They don't wimp out. It's perfectly fine. But that doesn't mean that states would have had to accept the NGSS. And my belief is that if intelligent design had been legal to teach, there would have been considerable pressure to modify the NGSS to decrease the emphasis on evolution before they were adopted. And any state that adopted the NGSS would just leave out that evolution section. And this is where I want to come back to that NCSE Penn State study. If the NGSS had not been adopted as widely as it had, would teachers be teaching as much evolution? I doubt it. Although the NGSS itself wouldn't have been affected, if Kitzmiller had declared ID legal to teach, the science standard in many states would have been pressed to downplay the teaching of evolution. The responsibility of teachers is to teach the curriculum of their district. Academic freedom, like I said before, is not a thing at the K-12 level. So if evolution isn't in the standards, it's not likely to be taught. I don't think we would be seeing this improvement in teachers teaching evolution that we see 51% up to 67% if Kitzmiller versus Dover had gone the other way. Now, standards largely govern the content of textbooks as well. And speaking of textbooks, let's not forget what happens to textbooks when states say teach X instead of Y. The publishers salute smartly and give them the books they want. If state standards were ID friendly, you can count on textbooks including the subject as publishers write books that will sell. So intelligent design would have the imprimatur of an official looking textbook purchased by the school board. Intelligent design was an effort to mask creationism so it could be taught in state schools. The anti-evolution effort continues in state and local policies, in state standard disputes, and as pressure on teachers in many parts of the country. That said, it would have been much, much worse if Kitzmiller versus Dover had gone the other way. We owe a lot to Kitzmiller. And to John E. Jones III, a Republican practicing Christian judge who has admitted to having no more than a liberal arts education in science, who listened with an open mind to the science, the philosophy, the theology, the history, the educational pedagogy, and, in my opinion, applied the law fairly. And in the opinion of not just me, but the science community, came to the correct decision about intelligent design unsuitability for the public school classroom. And I want to give him the last word in this final thing.
In the end, though, there is probably one thing everyone in the case can agree on.
The issue is certainly not over. One of the things that we've learned is that the opponents of evolution are persistent and resilient, and they're still out there.
I had thought at one point that we would make a breakthrough on this issue and change the scientific community in my lifetime. Now I'm somewhat sobered by the force of the counterattack that we have received, and I see that it's going to be a longer process than that.
I think history tells us that there is an enduring disagreement and dispute in the United States as it relates to evolution. By no means did my decision put a capstone on that, and that will proceed for generations, I suspect.
All right. Thank you very much for your attention. That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. And it's okay if I call you Jeannie here.
I think by now it would be okay.
Well,
everybody else can too. That's not just my old buddy Becky. All right.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. We do have time for some Q&A, and I guess I will just proceed with one that we got. Let's see, from Topher. It's not letting me see the. Gotta get the chat up here. Okay. Oh, okay. Topher asks, is there real evidence of a link between the new SEA and the old ID legislation? So that would be I guess the Scalia,
like Matsky's, yeah. They have slightly different foci. The Academic Freedom Acts, again, were kind of promoting this idea of teaching the alternatives to evolution, basically. Once the legal decisions went so strong against them, particularly after Kitzmiller, they gave up on that. And the Science Education Act that, alas, passed in Tennessee and I think Louisiana as well. Yeah, Tennessee, Louisiana, and I think there was a version that even passed in Arkansas, but the rest of them have died. Those really did stress the weaknesses of evolution, the attacking the evidence against evolution thing. So the two, there is a link in that the Discovery Institute was certainly trying very hard to influence both camps, but they're not. The link between them is this really gets into the weeds, but it's for those of you who are creation evolution controversy nerds. The policy in Louisiana from Ouachita Parish, which became the Louisiana Science Education Act, was certainly influenced by the intelligent design folks. So they're and the intelligent design folks did go in to Alabama and try to get them to change the wording of their Academic Freedom Acts so that it would be more open to the teaching of intelligent design. So yeah, it's a rabbit hole. It really is. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it sounds like it might be a little complicated to just kind of give a simple answer, but thank you. Okay, another question from Conrad. What are some of the, quote, gaps that were brought up against evolution in the case?
There were, okay, in the case, well, let me just deal with the creation, the idea of gaps in evolution is really an old creation science idea that the intelligent design people tried to finesse, but it basically boils down to if we don't have data for X, then creationism wins. In the intelligent design world, the favorite, of course, is the bacteria flagellum, which is a very complicated molecular structure. It involves a number of amino acids and proteins that are supposedly irreducibly complex. You have to have all of these structures together before you get this little tail that will whip around and make will make a bacterium go through the water, go through a liquid substrate. And this, of course, was Michael Behe's big idea, that irreducible complexity. And he claimed that there was no way that natural selection could build an irreducibly complex structure. Now, one of the lovely things is that absence of evidence is a very weak reed to base your scientific theory on, because sooner or later, chances are, somebody's going to figure out a solution for that. And in fact, that did happen with the bacteria flagellum. And Nick Motzke, who was one of the people with some colleagues over in England, came up with a very plausible evolutionary sequence for how you could get a bacteria flagellum through the process of natural selection. But traditionally, gaps in the fossil record were things like you don't have a complete series of fossils. Therefore, special creation could be used to explain each of these varieties rather than the process of evolution, which is a very silly idea. Natural selection in general is considered not a powerful enough mechanism to produce things of high complexity. So yeah, it's an old creationist trope, which has been dealt with by quite a few shelves of books, actually.
Okay, thank you, Jeannie. Another question. This refers to the matches between like the old versions of Panas and People and the newer versions, and how the
I hope you thought that was fun.
Fish with fins, and then but the question is there a similar analysis of legislation? And this might go into a little bit of the Project Blitz, where there's sort of, I guess.
Well, of course, Nick Motzke's analysis was legislation. I mean, he took, I forget how many total it was. It was scores of pieces of legislation that NCSE had collected, and broke them down to the pieces and traced the phrases throughout them, and was able to show ancestor and descendant relationships. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think
okay.
how the similar from, and maybe even now we're seeing perhaps some similar language across the United States from the Project Blitz thing, but that's sort of separate.
Yeah.
We need to go there right now, but
certainly legislation is swapped around from state to state.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question about that. Project Blitz being one of them. There were, earlier versions as well, of course. ALEC, the various legislation that comes out of ALEC, ALEC. Now, why can't I remember the name of what that stands for? But it's conservative and some legislation that is produced by this ALEC group and then is shopped around to state legislators around the country. It's kind of a predecessor of Project Blitz. Yeah, there's a way of tracing. In some cases, the legislation is identical.
Okay, another question from, I think this is from Robert. According to Scientific American in 2013 and Noam Chomsky, evolution is more accepted in the Islamic Republic of Iran generally and in science education. Can you speculate why this might be? Of course, I don't know if that's as of 2013, but
it's yeah. I actually have a couple of colleagues who have done research on the inclusion of evolution in science classes in the Islamic world, and none of it's very high. Talk about Iran versus Saudi Arabia versus Turkey or something. It's not that you're dealing with single digits, but it's definitely the low 2 digits. I mean, it's not very high percentages of textbooks. And of course, given other constraints that science educators in Islamic countries have to follow, and science in general in Islamic countries, it's really an uphill battle. I recall seeing excerpts from one textbook that is used in a number of predominantly Islamic countries, and it did talk about evolution, but it put it in the context of the Quran. So Mohammed had said in the Surah XYZ, such and such and such and such. And this can be interpreted to imply that, that evolution took place from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms. It's like, it can't be real unless it's in the Quran, right? And sometimes in order to make something real, the teacher or the scientist has to just really tweak and twist and crunch and spindle and mutilate to make the Quran support their point of view. What's interesting about Muslim countries, particularly a place like Turkey, where anti-evolutionism is pretty high, is that it gets mixed up with national pride and national politics as well as science and religion. And so in Turkey, you have a pretty strong anti-Western political strand, at least in modern day Turkey. I mean, obviously that wasn't the case, with the founding of the Turkish Republic, unfortunately. But nowadays, the West is, they're bad guys. And because Darwin was an Englishman, evolution is associated with Western hegemony, and therefore, is probably wrong. So you get the conflation of a lot of different social movements going on in many of these countries. I don't know specifically about Iran. It is. I do recall seeing those data. And I do recall and thinking, that's interesting. Iran being slightly higher, but not enormously higher. I wouldn't want to say within the margin of error, but it wasn't a huge difference between them. So I don't have a good answer for that.
Thank you. Okay, you mentioned academic freedom in universities. So this is versus, I guess, the public schools.
High school, yeah, K-12.
Are there many university professors that teach creationism or intelligent design? And are these these cases checked by academic peers?
Of course, in Bible colleges and some religiously affiliated institutions, you will get the teaching of creationism and anti-evolutionism. Interestingly enough, there's a very strong evolutionary biology unit at Brigham Young, as well as Notre Dame and Baylor. So you sort of get the big three, the Mormons, the Catholics, and the Baptists. And so, you can't even say all religious colleges. In terms of public institutions, at NCSE, and I don't know what's happened since I've left, but I doubt that it's changed greatly. But at NCSE, when I was there, we would, every couple of years, we'd get a request from some, mostly community college, interestingly enough, where we'd get a request saying, what do? We just found out that one of our teachers is dissing evolution. One of our teachers is teaching his students that evolution is really kind of shaky science, and that that it's not all it's cracked up to be. We have not heard of anybody actually teaching creationism or intelligent design. We have had reports of anti-evolutionist teachings, and generally those are shut down pretty fast because the chair of the science department, the person's colleagues, don't want to get the reputation that this department is engaging in these kinds of activities. I mean, it's you're considered really an inferior institution if you're going to be doing stuff like that. So it hasn't, I do not see this a problem at a university level. And of course, the people teaching at a university level are going to have, at the community college level, you do get a lot of people with master's degrees, but they are graduate degrees. And more and more at the community college level, you have people with PhDs. So these are people who actually have had exposure and ample exposure to the science. So they should know that evolution is really what happened.
All right, we're at our hour and a half time frame for this whole presentation. However, you know, there are still a lot of people online, and if you're willing to go a little bit longer, and the rest of you can stay if you'd like. If you have, there are a number of other questions. So if Jeannie, if you're okay with taking a few more questions.
I can hang in for a little longer, yes.
Okay. And well, here's one that I think many of us have on our minds at this time. And this is from, I think, Harvey. What is your expectation of the vulnerability created by the, quote, new Supreme Court?
Mm-hmm. You know, it's funny. We've at NCSE, we've had a legal advisory committee for decades now. And I remember back in the, you know, like the mid 2000s, 2004, 2005, one of our members, a wonderful First Amendment lawyer named Steve Guy, who said that he would not want to bring a First Amendment case to the Supreme Court for at least the next 20 years. And that was well before we got the court we've got today. Okay, that was when we only had a you know, slight majority of conservative people, and not the far right shift of the court. I mean, you know, when somebody like Roberts could be considered the median of the court, that is just jaw-dropping, totally jaw-dropping. I don't think this is a very good time to be taking constitutional issues, First Amendment issues, especially to the Supreme Court. That said, the creationism issue seems, I mean, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture here, but the creationism issue seems to be in its own little kind of cotton batting. Decisions about creation and evolution have generally been quite lopsided in favor of evolution at the Supreme Court level and even district court level. But again, the creationists are getting smarter. They've given up teaching the Bible. They've given up teaching, you know, something called creation science. They've given up intelligent design because somebody's going to ask, who's the designer? And pretty soon it becomes pretty apparent that the designer is God. And so therefore you've got an agent. So therefore you're advancing a religion. So no, you can't do that. I think arguments on students' right to know kind of arguments might possibly find a footing with this court. Teachers' right to teach, even though at the K-12 level, this is something that's really quite circumscribed. And that may not be a viable argument. But, you know, I'm not a lawyer and I don't even play one on television. Don't take legal advice from a physical anthropologist, right? It's probably not a good idea. So yeah, we have seen that First Amendment issues at this Supreme Court are not fun to think about.
Well, we appreciate your input on that anyway, certainly. And actually, I have a question here.
Yes.
The discussion about teaching where we're at sort of now, and to teach the, quote, full range of views on evolution. And is this standard being applied only to evolution, or is it being encouraged on other scientific theories that are not in biology, but astronomy and geology and whatever other things you have? You know, is it just the idea that evolution is being sort of pinpointed in this area?
Yeah, you know, if you remember Susan Epperson's case way back in '68, one of the points that was made by the justice who wrote that decision is that it was clear that this was advocacy of religion, because the only topic in the curriculum that was chosen for this kind of treatment was evolution. And, you know, it's because evolution has consequences for particular religious views, like conservative Christian views. Similarly, if you look at this question of teaching the full range of scientific views, which is bogus, because of course you can teach the full range of scientific views as long as they're scientific. You just can't toss in religious views. And if there were alternatives to evolution, they would be taught, but there aren't any. The only explanation for the variety of living things that we have today, say in biological evolution, the only explanation for the diversity of living things is that they descended with modification from common ancestors, in other words, evolution. And there are no alternative theories. If there were, we'd teach them, full stop. But evolution is chosen because it has consequences. Photosynthesis, not so much. Geology, not so much. Physics, chemistry, these other fields don't really have the kinds of consequences for one's ideological point of view that evolution has. And so you don't get this notion that we should teach the full range of views on chemistry. We'll teach the periodic table and, oh, wait, that's it. There isn't an alternative to the periodic table. So they just don't come up. They just don't come up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that's rather telling in and of itself. Someone asked a question, let's see, who was this? Spencer. The title of the book, Of Pandas and People, he says it seems like kind of a bait and switch name for a science textbook, and that you could see a science book being named this, but not a creation. It's just kind of the name.
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah. And
well, it's even more clever than that, because you remember that it was published in the late 80s. That was when it first hit the light of day. And if you remember a very famous essay by Stephen Jay Gould, The Panda's Thumb, and a book of natural history articles called The Panda's Thumb, which was a very popular book. And The Panda's Thumb, of course, is a very interesting example of something that is really weird. It's, most land vertebrates have 5 digits, at least at some point in their lives. Horses, of course, have, this is going to be a rude gesture, but horses are walking on their middle finger. But if you look at a panda's thumb, it actually has 6 fingers, because what it uses for, as this sort of grasping digit is actually a sesamoid bone that's of the wrist that's been modified into a grasping appendage. And Gould deals with this and shows how natural selection could have produced this. And the panda's thumb is used by Gould as an example of something that's very quirky, but which evolution could produce. Of Pandas and People takes the panda's thumb as an example of something that is much more likely to have been designed, because it's a really weird kind of thing. You couldn't have all of these components together at the same time by natural selection. So therefore, it had to have been designed. So it's, it was actually a book that was intended to be used as a textbook, but they didn't have any people working with them who knew anything about education. So the book is completely unsuitable for a high school, much less a junior high science classroom. It just, pedagogically, it just isn't organized right, and the explanations are, it just doesn't work as a high school textbook. They got a little bit better later on in the late 80s. Of Pandas and People was produced by the Foundation for Thought and Ethics. And in the late 80s, the Discovery Institute folks came up with what was intended to be a high school textbook, sort of as a successor to Pandas. And it actually looked a little bit more like a high school supplementary book, but it also was full of nonsense. So, hopefully, we don't see very many examples of anybody having bought it.
Okay, I think we're going to wind it up here. Many of the other comments coming in right now are thank you to you, Jeannie.
You are more than welcome. It's very pleasant spending an evening with you.
We here at the Secular Hub are happy you could join us and hope you enjoyed listening to today's talk. To learn more about the Secular Hub and our upcoming events, to become a member, or to show your support, find us on the web at secularhub.org.